Good morning. I'm Matt Spooner, Industry Thought Leader at Kinaxis, and I'm joined today by Tariq Farooq for this edition of Big Ideas in Supply Chain. Tariq has got 30 years of supply chain experience in the CPG industry with leadership positions at Procter & Gamble, and most recently as SVP Supply Chain at Sanofi. So welcome, Tariq. And I want to start the conversation today to talk a little bit about how do executive teams view the supply chain, and how has the the pandemic in the last couple of years and also the recent supply chain disruptions, has that actually changed the way that boards and executive teams look at and consider the supply chain?
Well, look, first of all, thanks for having me. That's a great question. I would start by saying that if we look over many years, the perception of the importance of supply chain has, overall grown, particularly in CPG companies. If you look at companies like, CPG and high tech, by the way, if you look at companies like P&G, Unilever, Coke, Amazon, Apple, and so on, they've all been doing a lot of great work over the years to drive performance and capability in the supply chains in order to create value for their consumers, for their customers, and for their business. And they've been doing a lot of great innovation, innovations that have allowed them to improve service, reduce costs, reduce cash. And therefore, I think in those companies, the perception and the importance of supply chain within the C-suite has been very high, right? Now, is that the same everywhere? Of course not, right? And I remember if you go back sort of 20, 30 years ago, across many companies, C-suite folks might have equated supply chain to a bit like payroll, with the quote being that if I get my check at the end of the month, I don't realize payroll exists. I only realize they exist when I don't get my check. And supply chain was a bit like that, right? Nobody really understood it. Nobody really cared about it as long as it continued to deliver. So I think, as I said, you've seen this improvement in those very progressive companies. And therefore, I think as a result of that, over many years, many other companies have followed suit, not just in CPG, but in other industries as well, where they've seen the importance of supply chain and the need to improve its performance in order to create the value that I talked about. Now, when you look at the last sort of 2 or 3 years during the pandemic, and then also many of the supply chain challenges we've seen over the last 18 months or so, I think that perception of the importance of supply chain, the perception of what supply chain can do, has grown for everybody, not just within the C-suite, but for your average person on the street, right? Because they've realized that in the absence of robust supply chains, you just simply don't get what you want, when you want it on the shelves. So I think I would say that the importance of supply chain has improved over time, mainly led by industries like CPG in particular, but that's expanded across industries, almost everywhere.
And do you see the boards and the C-suite bringing up the topic of supply chains in board meetings or at executive levels? Do you see that has changed much over the last few years?
Yeah, I think so. And I think particularly as 3 things have happened. I think one is that as supply chain risks have increased, as we've seen over the last few years, boards and the C-suite have become far more engaged on identifying those risks, assessing those risks, and making sure that supply chain teams have robust plans in place to mitigate against them, right, as they've worked to become more resilient over time. So that's one. Secondly, I think that as ESG and the environmental component of ESG has become more important, not just for consumers and customers, but also for investors themselves, the active engagement on supply chain from boards has also increased because they want to understand what's the environmental impact that our supply chains have, how can we reduce that impact, and therefore how can we make sure that from a stakeholder and a investor standpoint, we continue to be attractive, in the outside world.
Okay, that's really interesting. And you brought up actually a really important point there, which was around boards focusing more on resilience. Supply chain leaders would all agree that having a resilient supply chain is really important. But I've been slightly surprised in some of the conversations that I've had where supply chain leaders are saying, "Oh, resilience is important, but it has to be cost neutral." Now, the question that I have really around that resilience is that a realistic aspiration to have, that we need to have resilient supply chains that are also, don't cost any more to deliver that resilience?
Look, another excellent question. I would say that cost is important at any time. And of course, in a inflationary environment, it becomes even more important, right? And if we look over many years, many companies are focused on cost. I wouldn't say to the exclusion of resilience, but resilience wasn't such a big topic, right? And in that context, companies were designing and operating their supply chains to be as efficient as possible. So they were going for monosourcing, for example, having one supplier, which drove scale, which drove efficiencies, drove down price. They were going for global or regional production, which again, drove scale, drove down price. They were going for lower and lower inventories, thanks to just-in-time kind of methodologies. All of those are great when you're in an environment where you're not having very many supply chain risks or supply chain shocks. But as we've seen over the last few years, that's not the case anymore. And therefore, I think that as we move ahead, companies are becoming far more sensitized to the topic of resilience. Boards are becoming far more sensitized to that topic. They want to understand how they can be more resilient, how they can sustain some of the supply chain shocks that may come up. And therefore, some of the changes you're seeing is companies moving away from monosourcing to multi-sourcing, moving away from having a few regional or global production sites to having many production sites, moving away from having lower inventories and just-in-time kind of methodologies to increasing their inventories in order to be resilient. So I think that the question isn't so much about do you have to be cost neutral, but because I think in the long term, I have faith that supply chain professionals will be creative and innovative in how they drive resilience while at the same time being efficient and cost neutral in the longer term. So the challenge really becomes is how do you shift from where you have been, where cost efficiency might have been the primary objective, to being in a situation which is more balanced as we move ahead. So I think supply chain professionals will do that by being very creative and innovative in terms of which resiliency risks they choose to manage, how they choose to manage them, and when they choose to manage them. And I think increasingly what they'll be doing is leveraging some of the efficiencies that come because of digitalization, because of automation, because of all the great talent that's been developed across supply chains and the supply chain networks that they establish to offset some of those incremental risks. And I think in summary, what I would say is, look, if you go back some years ago, as supply chain professionals, we were really trying to balance, the famous triangle of service, cost, and cash. And I think as we move ahead, we'll have to figure out how to balance not just that triangle, but that triangle will shift to being at least a pentagon, where you're trying to balance, as you design and operate your supply chains, balance between service, cost, cash, environmental impact, and resilience as well. And that's why I think it becomes increasingly important for all of us that we leverage digital tools, advanced planning systems, and so on, that allow us to design and then operate those supply chains while we're trying to balance that pentagon, right? If you have a very simple business, a few SKUs, a simple network, then you can do those kinds of things in Excel. But as your business becomes more and more complex, then you do need some of those advanced planning tools that enable you to balance some of the trade-offs as you're trying to manage that pentagon that I just mentioned.
So that's actually a really interesting perspective. So on one hand, you're saying that actually for some supply chains, cost might be the overriding driver. But for other supply chains, it's much more nuanced, and putting in additional cost to to achieve a better balance on resilience, or having a higher level of inventory or cost to create a more sustainable supply chain, then becomes a part of the balancing act. So so what you're describing is supply chains becoming more complex rather than necessarily more expensive, and having these multiple different aspects that need to be balanced.
So yeah, even for companies over time, they may have different sets of challenges depending on the context they're in. At some point, their primary focus may be cost, less so on resilience, and other times, resilience or sustainability might be the more preeminent topic for them. And I think as things move along, for all companies, they're going to have to balance all five of those elements. So service, cost, cash, sustainability, and resilience, because that's what their customers, their consumers, their stakeholders require them to do. So I think the simple world of we'll be as efficient as possible and supply, what our customers want, will decreasingly be the case, and companies will have to manage, across those five elements that we've said, just said.
And that almost brings me back to the original question that I asked about the change in how the executives perceive the supply chain. Because as you've just been describing this new paradigm, this no longer sounds like it's purely a supply chain type discussion. This actually sounds as though it's a holistic business discussion, and is something that the CFO, the CEO, the other executive teams, as well as the chief supply chain officer, need to be working on. And it's now moved beyond just a supply chain discussion. Would you agree that you would see supply chains moving in that direction?
Yeah, and as a supply chain professional who's been in supply chain for more than 30 years, I would like to believe that supply chain was always something that was important to the business as a whole. But I think you're absolutely right that more and more that is the case, and that as we think about how we design and operate supply chains, it's not just a topic for the head of supply chain, but it's a topic for the executive committee and indeed the board overall.
I think that's certainly a big topic that we need to think about, and need to think, okay, so how does this change the world that we operate in? Maybe just as a sort of slightly light-hearted question, as a final question. So if you were the chief supply chain officer for the world, what would be the one thing that you would change, or the one direction you would try and move in?
I think the biggest challenge for all of us as we move ahead, and I'm at risk of repeating what I've said earlier, but I think the biggest challenge and opportunity for us is finding ways of more effectively balancing that pentagon of service, cost, cash, sustainability, and resilience. So I think if I was the chief supply chain officer of the world, I'd be wanting to put in place the tools, the processes, the capabilities, the talents, and so on, that enable us to better balance those five elements. Because by doing that, not only will we continue to serve our consumers, our customers, and our stakeholders, but we'll do that in ways which are more resilient, and very importantly, we'll do that in ways which are less impactful on the planet as a whole.
So thank you very much, Tariq. That's been a really insightful conversation, and thank you for taking part in this month's Big Ideas in Supply Chain.
Look, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.